Have you ever said yes, and when every part of you was screaming no? Not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid to disappoint, afraid to be rejected, afraid to be alone. What if I told you that the guilt you feel isn't weakness? It's a message from your past. A signal from your inner child, still trying to survive. In this video, you're about to discover why saying no feels so hard, and how breaking free from guilt is the first step toward reclaiming your true self.
If you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or like the wounds from your past still hold you back, you're not alone. This space is for you. Here, we heal, we grow, and we rediscover who we truly are. Beyond the pain, beyond the past. And if you're ready to step into your healing journey and finally embrace your authentic self, hit that subscribe button. Because your inner child matters, and together, we can rewrite your story.
There's also this belief, of course, that if I say no, or if I say no, I feel guilty, right? If I say no, that I'm guilty. How many of you got that feeling, that sense that if I say no, I'm going to feel guilty? It's not a big problem for many of you? Okay, great. Well, now okay, great. Well, let me tell you about guilt a little bit, because you need to learn to get into a different relationship with guilt. Okay? So we will do anything not to feel guilty. There are two ways to deal with not wanting to feel guilty. One way is never to say no. Then you never have to feel guilty. You're always saying yes, 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 yes. Except you're going to get a headache, back spasms, dry mouth, lack of sleep, fatigue, stress, overwhelm, frequent colds, and finally some disease or depression. But you never said no. So you never had to feel guilty. The other way some people deal with the feeling of guilt is that they just shut down their conscience altogether. So they never feel the guilt because they totally shut it down. We call them sociopaths or politicians, as the case may be, okay? Well, we don't want to do that either. The only way to deal with guilt is to make friends with it. When you try not to feel it, when you try not to feel guilty, you always end up in trouble. So I want to give you a story about how to relate to guilt. Okay? So let me tell you a story from the Bible. You've read the Old Testament or you've seen the movie The Ten Commandments. You know how the Jews are slaves in Egypt, right? And then Moses becomes their leader, and he sees the burning bush, and the voice of God speaks to him and says that it's your task to lead your people out of slavery in Egypt. So that's the biblical story. Again, the story in the Bible says that, if you remember, that just during the time that Moses was going to be born, the Pharaoh's prophets foretell that some Hebrew slave about to be born will challenge the Pharaoh and lead the Jews out of Egypt's slavery. So therefore they decide that all Hebrew firstborn males have to be thrown into the Nile. Remember the story? And so what happens is that Moses' mother complies with that order, throws the kid in, with one exception though, which is what? She puts him into a reed basket, a basket woven of reeds, and puts the kid into the Nile River. And then the story in the Bible says that Moses floats down the Nile and is fished out of the water, pulled out of the water by who? Remember that? Not a lot of Bible scholars here. You haven't seen the movie The Ten Commandments? Charlton Heston. Okay, well, but this is before your time. I got it. Anyone remembers who pulls Moses out of the water? Sorry? The queen, the Pharaoh's daughter. You're close, the Pharaoh's daughter. the Pharaoh's daughter, okay? In fact, what Moses means, the word Moses means pulled out of the water. And so Moses is pulled out of the water by the Pharaoh's daughter, so he's actually brought up at the Pharaoh's court. And I won't go on with the story, except to tell you that the Bible also says that Moses was a stutterer. He had a speech impediment. So when it came time for him to speak to the Pharaoh later on, decades later, he didn't do the speaking. It was his brother Aaron that did the speaking for him. Now, you're wondering what this got to do with guilt. Okay? You're wondering what this got to do with guilt. Okay? Well, I'm getting there. There's a legend that's not in the Bible, but an ancient Hebrew legend that explains how Moses becomes a stutterer. And here's where I need your attention, because I'm going to ask you a question. The story is that Moses is being brought up by the Pharaoh's daughter at the court like a little prince. And the Pharaoh's soothsayers once more prophesize that this kid is going to challenge the Pharaoh's authority when he grows up. And if that's true, they have to kill him. So they decide to put him to a test. And the test is this. They put in front of him two sparkling objects. One of them is a glowing ember of coal, and the other is a royal diamond. If Moses chooses the diamond, it means that he's got royal ambition and he has to be killed. So they put these two sparkling objects in front of the little toddler Moses, and he's delighted, and his eyes light up, and he looks at these two scintillating, sparkling materials, and he starts to reach for the diamond. At which moment, Gabriel, an angel of God standing behind him, grabs his arm and puts it onto the coal, which Moses picks up and, like a toddler will, brings it to his lips and burns his lips, and that's where he develops a speech impediment. Okay? Now the question I have for you now is to decide in your own mind, was that angel Moses' friend or enemy? And what would you say, some of you? What would you say? He's a friend because he saved him from being killed, even though he burned his lips, right? But he's a friend. Anybody not agree that he's a friend? So he's a friend. So I want you to consider that guilt is that friend. When you're small, you can't help. You have no choice. When you're very small, you have no choice but to go along with your parents' expectations. Because if you don't go along with your parents' expectations, then you might lose the attachment relationship. This is what we've been talking about the whole day. So there has to be a mechanism in your brain that says, you better not do that. You better not say no. That mechanism is guilt. That guilt helps you to maintain the attachment relationship with your parents, and therefore you survive. It also gives you a speech impediment. You forget how to say no. But that guilt that kept you in compliance with your parents' expectations when you were very small also saved your life because it maintained the attachment relationship. That guilt is not your enemy. That guilt is your friend. The only problem with it is that it's a stupid friend. It's got no learning capacity. It doesn't know that you've grown up now. It doesn't know that you're no longer in that dependent situation. It just gives you the same story. If you say no, you're a bad person. That's all it knows how to say. Your problem is that you don't want to feel it. You don't want to make friends with it. My suggestion is, next time you feel guilt, be happy about it. Say to yourself, oh my God, I said no. I feel guilty. This means hot dog. I must have done something for myself for the first time in my life. Thank God. Call your friends, have a party. In other words, rather than pushing guilt away, just embrace it and say, hello, old buddy. Thank you for saving my life as a kid, but you know what? I don't need your advice anymore. I'll listen to it, but I don't have to follow it automatically. I can think about it and make my own decision. Okay? So that's how you deal with guilt. Not by pushing it away, not by acting on it, which just make it stronger, but by actually accepting that it's there, but not listening to its advice.
Maybe you learned to smile when you wanted to cry, to say yes when your soul whispered no, not because you were weak, but because, as a child, love was survival. You needed to be good, quiet, easy to love, even if it meant abandoning yourself. And now, that same pattern lives in your body, like muscle memory. But here, in this moment, you're not wrong. You're not too much. You're simply remembering what it feels like to come home to yourself. Slowly, gently, without shame.
So you mentioned some, say, parenting approaches that you disagree with. Are there any approaches or recommendations that you think do more harm than good with respect to contending with trauma or moving towards wholeness?
Yeah, any parenting practice or educational practice that focuses on behavior rather than the child's underlying emotional dynamics is going to be harmful. Because what we want out of child rearing is at the end of it, there should be an autonomous human being, respectful of themselves and of others, who can be authentic and connected at the same time. That's our goal. I don't think anybody would disagree that that's our goal for human beings. Now, that's a natural developmental process as long as we provide the right conditions for it. But nothing in nature develops in the wrong context. So, I could have an acorn in my hand, and the nature of that acorn is to become an oak tree, but not if I leave it on my desk.
Right.
It needs, water and soil and sunlight and so on. A lot of parenting and educational practices focus not on the long-term goal and development, but on fixing the kids' behaviors in the short term. So, we talk about kids are acting out. What do you do when a kid acts out? Well, look at this phrase, acting out. What does it mean to act something out? When I say acting out, when I say a kid is acting out, you will probably think of a kid who's being oppositional or rude or disobedient or aggressive. But that's not what the phrase means. Acting out means to portray in behavior that which we haven't got the words to say in language. So in a game of charades, where you're not allowed to speak, what do you have to do? You have to act it out.
Act it out.
If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language and you had to portray hunger, you'd have to act it out. Kids are acting out their emotional needs. The question is, are we going to respond to the child, or are we going to try and suppress the behavior? So much of what's taught as parenting advice is designed to manipulate or shape or suppress kids' behaviors rather than understanding the child. And by the way, this is also true of adults as well. As we look at human beings and we don't see what's really driving them, we just either approve or disapprove of how they're behaving, but we don't make much of an effort. The legal system specializes in not understanding why people behave the way they behave, just in suppressing it. Which is why in Canada, where indigenous people make up 5% of the population, they make up 30% of the jail population. And indigenous women make up 50% of the female jail population in this country. It's an absolute scandal. Same in the US. The more oppressed you are, the more marginalized you are, the more you've been traumatized by history, and you know which groups those are in the United States, the more you're going to end up in jail. Because the legal system doesn't understand trauma, it doesn't understand human development, and it confuses punishment with rehabilitation. So as a result, in terms of supporting healthy growth of human beings at any level, we need understanding of what's driving this behavior. And it's not a question of allowing bad behavior or permitting it or encouraging it, but it's a question of what are we going to do about the phenomena of aggression or drug use, or in the case of children, rudeness or disobedience or anything else, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to try and just suppress the behavior? Then you end up where we are, with millions of people in jail, and lots of kids with learning difficulties and behavior problems, and millions of kids being medicated. Or are we going to try and understand what's happening, what's driving it? What are the social, cultural dynamics that are driving so much dysfunction? It's not that hard to perceive. We have the science, we have the research, we're just not applying it. When a child is born, the child has two needs. The first need is for attachment. And attachment is contact, connection, love. Without that, the human child does not survive. Any mammalian child or even an avian child doesn't survive. So that as soon as you get past the level of reptiles, the reptile is hatched, the mother's long gone by then, and the reptile infant either lives or dies, but there's no attachment to a parenting figure. As soon as you get to the level of birds now, the baby bird has to have an attachment with the parents. The parents have to be attached to the baby. Otherwise, the infant simply does not survive. Mammalians even more so, and most so the human, because we're the least developed, the least mature, with the least developed brains, and the most dependent for the longest period of time of any creature in the universe. So our attachment needs are enormous, and they remain important throughout lifetime because we have to have attachments to form societies, social groups, without which we don't survive. So attachment is a huge need. We have to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. That's just a basic human need. But we have another need as well, which is for authenticity. Authenticity is the capacity, as I said earlier, to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express who we are and manifest who we are in our activities and in our relationships. Now, why is that? Well, think of a human being in the evolutionary period who's not in touch with their body and their gut feelings. How long do they survive out there in the wild? So authenticity is another huge survival need. Great. So far, so good. But what happens to a child where the attachment need is not compatible with the need for authenticity? In other words, if I'm authentic, my parents will reject me. If I feel what I feel and express what I feel and insist on my own truth, my parents can't handle it. And parents convey those messages unconsciously all the time. Not because they mean to, not because they don't love the child, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because they themselves are suppressed, or traumatized, or hurt, or stressed. So I convey that message many times to my children, believe me, without any conscious desire to do so. In fact, it was the very opposite of what I wished to convey. But that they're not acceptable the way they are, with their emotions the way they are, that's the message my kids got. And most children get that in our society. Now, what does the child do with that? Well, if I give up my attachment for the sake of authenticity, I lose my relationships on which my life depends. Therefore, there's no question. What becomes suppressed is our authenticity, our emotions. And then we become 25 and 30 or 35, 40, and we don't know who we are. And somebody asks us, what do you feel? You say, I have no idea. And how many times we've all had the experience of having an inkling of a strong gut feeling, but we're ignoring it. We're ignoring it and we get into trouble. Well, that tells us what happened. What happened was that at some point we found out that it was too costly for our attachment relationships to be in touch with our gut feelings. So then it becomes our first, not our first nature, but our second nature, to suppress our feelings, to lose touch with ourselves, and to suppress our gut feelings. And then we pay the cost later on in the form of addictions, mental illness, or any range of physical illnesses. But it all began with this tragic conflict that children should never be confronted with, but are all the time, between authenticity on the one hand and attachment on the other. And even as adults, so many people are suffering because They want to be themselves, but they're afraid to be because they know, or at least they fear, that if they're themselves, they're going to lose important attachment relationships in their lives.
The guilt you carry was never the enemy. It was the child in you doing what it had to do to survive. But survival is no longer the goal. Healing is, and healing begins when you honor your truth, even when it feels uncomfortable. Saying no doesn't make you unkind. It makes you whole. May this be the moment you stop apologizing for existing and start remembering who you truly are beneath the silence.
Healing takes time, and you don't have to do it alone. If this message resonated with you, know that your journey matters. Be gentle with yourself, keep exploring, and surround yourself with support. If you haven't yet, subscribe and join this community. We're in this together. And before you go, comment, "I am healing," to affirm your growth. You are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Healing